Amazing. Right, I think we have lots of attendees. So hi everyone. Welcome to SUGi Talks. We'll do our official. So I'm on the main screen, right? So welcome to SUGi Talks. We are very privileged to have you all with us today. And this is our very first live webinar. So it's our first time doing something like this. It's kind of a continuation of our podcast, SUGi Talks, which we have 12 fabulous episodes of, and I recommend you check them out. But today we are very privileged to have Nadina Galle, Adrian Wong, and Kalpana Arias, who all are at the vanguard of technology and urban nature. So we're very pleased to have them with us today. So as you all know, our talk today is about biodiversity and belonging. And within this, we'll cover all the ways nature connectedness helps root us in our urban environment by building well-being and community, and also tackling big issues like the ecological crisis, the mental health crisis, and also supporting climate resilience. So lots of stuff in there. But first, I am very pleased to introduce you to SUGi's founder, Elise, who's going to have a few words. So Elise, you can take over.
Well, hi everyone. Welcome to our very first SUGi Talks. I mean, we're excited, but equally a little bit nervous. So thank you for all being there today. It will make it extra special. And yes, I know there's a question. We are going to record this. I do not see the button on you, just make sure. Where do I start? Very shortly, because we want to hear from Nadina, Kalpana, and Adrian ASAP. But here's the thing. So people, plants, and the land are the beating heart of SUGi and of our work. SUGi is a grassroots movement. It started in May 2019, and it's really born out of a desire that we wanted to bring the wild and to bring biodiversity back to where we live and work. See, I mean, if you think back 2017, 18, it was all these headlines about millions of trees being planted. And we thought, but where and how many are surviving? So our solution is based upon the Miyawaki method. You might be familiar with it, and many of you must have heard it. It's kind of become a movement. There's a lot of mini, tiny micros, but we call them pocket forests. And the idea is that we start with the soil, we plant densely, and we mulch heavily. So we do not plant trees, we create these ultra dense pockets of forest that become self-sustaining very rapidly. So today in our portfolio of 245 projects, over 150 are self-sustaining. So you can think of them as microbiomes. You know, they clean the air, they cool the air, and we have the temperatures. But you hear all about this. What I would like to touch upon is that really, without our global network of forest makers who work with the communities on the ground, this would have not been possible. This is, again, you know, it's the people and together that we build this movement. In just 6 years, you know, 245 pocket forests across 26 countries. And that goes from Beirut, where the first one was planted, and hello, Adib, I know you're there, to the Yakima tribe in Topanish. You know, each forest is really become a living testament to ecological and social renewal. And that goes also from hospital grounds in Chile to schoolyards in Belgium and India to like neighborhoods in Cape Town and London. They nurture mental well-being and they encourage the physical activity. And then also that exchange. I always say they become like magnets for human connections. So on that note, I'm absolutely thrilled today. Again, Nadina, Kalpana, and Adrian, and thank you, Onya, for guiding everyone to dive deep into the topic, because really right now there's a lot of research that has been done on traditional green spaces like parks and street lining, but I'm really personally very keen on like understanding more the importance of the wild urban spaces and why they matter and what they do to us. So I'll leave it over to you. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you so much, Elise. So I'm going to switch the view to gallery. So, woohoo! I think everyone can see everyone now. Yep. So now I'm going to hand it over to our lovely speakers to introduce themselves and their work. So Kalpana, is it okay if I start with you? Then we'll go Nadina, and then we'll go Adrian, who will have a fabulous presentation.
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Elise, for that introduction as well. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to dive deep into these topics. I don't know if we're going to be able to do it all in 1 hour, but I think it's the start of um, really incredible, you know, provocations, thoughts, and hopefully practical actions that we can all take in our day-to-day lives. So I'm Kalpana. I'm a guerrilla gardener, a technologist, and a nature rights activist. I'm the founder of Nowadays, which is transitioning into play. And it's a social enterprise that's fighting for urban nature across cities worldwide. We also campaign for the right to grow, which is a movement that is a petition in governments and councils to give people the right to grow food in public land, particularly in cities. At the moment, we have been organizing across London. So if there's anyone in the call that is in London, if you want to learn more, please reach out, and we'd love to kind of include you in the next learning networks. But what we're doing at the moment is mobilizing and organizing so that we can make sure that cities are designed with people and nature in mind, but the solutions are coming from grassroots communities themselves. And over the years, our work within grassroots organizations has sort of led us to dive deeper into technology, which oftentimes gets kind of painted as something that is opposite to nature. But nowadays, we really look at the ways that technology can actually become part of the same ecologies that we are living in. And in that way, have a better relationship that is more balanced, but also is centered with justice in mind, especially as we continue to build technologies. And so we're kind of building ourselves into this nature tech space. And that's led us to create this really incredible project called Glitch. And I'll be sharing more about that later, but Glitch is essentially a cyber gardening tool where users in any city, and at the moment it's activated in London, as our flagship space, that users are able to map out green gaps and potential sites for growing and gardening, and connect with local growing groups, as well as sort of exploring the nature that is nearby for a lot of different reasons. I think the tech that's available to us at the moment gives us a very siloed viewpoints of the places and the cities that we live in. And so we don't really get to explore, what our actual local green spaces is. And I'll give a really short example and then I'll pass it off. But for example, if you were to kind of Google your closest green space through Google Maps, it shows you a route to get there that is connected more to like high streets and markets and sales, and it sort of increases that sort of consumer perspective as citizens, as consumers, as opposed to citizens as ecological participants or people who can, just play and live and breathe in a city in their day-to-day lives. So we've been kind of exploring ways that we can decentralize technologies in order for them to be built for people, for communities, and for nature. And so I'm really excited to be here and to share more about those projects and more about those kind of thoughts along the way. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Nadine.
Have all of you here, and thank you, SUGi, for having me. Such a pleasure. I've been such a fan of SUGi's work for so long. One of the reasons is that, to what Elise was saying earlier, so much of the research in the world that I come from has been very much focused on parks and urban forests in a very traditional sense, planting individual trees. And that work, of course, still has its place, but I think we're starting to understand just how urgent it is to add these points of what SUGi likes to call urban acupuncture, which I think is such a clever way to talk about it. These ideas of finding these pressure points, having these small interventions that can bring life force back into these otherwise underutilized lands, and doing that at a really rapid pace. And that's exactly what we need. We need to be doing this at a rapid pace. And the pocket forest, Miyawaki method, the SUGi methodology, allows us to do that. So big fan and pleasure to be here. My name is Nadina Galle. I'm trained as an ecological engineer, which essentially just means that I bring together the worlds of ecology and technology. I come from the study of nature-based solutions, trying to figure out what are the ways that we can use natural elements to really solve a lot of very urban issues. During my PhD, I became quite obsessed with this role that emerging technologies were potentially going to have in that space. But it really kind of all stems from this mission, this love for nature, and this really fascination and love and obsession with wanting to get as many people back into nature and outdoors as humanly possible. I want to radically see people spending a lot more outdoors and seeing nature become a daily part of people's lives and routines again. Not an additional thing that we need to do on top of an already overflowing to-do list, but something that is built into our everyday routines. And a large part of making that happen is, of course, is redesigning quite radically what our urban spaces look like, considering this is the default habitat of humankind. And to restore that connection to the natural world, I have become more and more fascinated by the role that technology can play in that. Not as a distraction, but simply as a bridge to be able to reconnect people to it, to meet them where they are in a way, but also as a tool to actually show people the value of nature in ways that human beings themselves are not able to express as clearly. And I call all of that the Internet of Nature. And the Internet of Nature, I founded that or coined that term about 7 years ago now. I've been working on that ever since. And the Internet of Nature is taken a lot of different forms. And so my work has also taken a lot of different forms, but I work on a lot of different ways to bring these technologies into practice. So taking them from research into practice. So what that looks like is I've run a multitude of different citizen science campaigns, the most famous one being the City Nature Challenge, for example. I've co-created trees that can tweet so that we're better able to have an understanding of the plights of urban street trees and find ways to communicate with human beings. I've helped co-develop and scale nature prescription apps that actually track how much time you're spending in nature from a day-to-day and nudging you to get outside more. I've helped deploy AI-powered insect cameras that are able to observe and document biodiversity in ways that human beings simply are not able to. And all of these different projects, they fall under this umbrella of the Internet of Nature. And I speak about that, I write about that, I podcast about that. Most recently, I published a book called The Nature of Our Cities. And Daniel of SUGi made this lovely matching background behind me. And through all of that, the goal is not just about using the Internet of Nature to better map, monitor, and manage its greenery and the nature, but in fact really radically reconnect citizens with that nature as well. So if there's one thing that you take away from me and from my work, is that I want the world to be radically reoriented to have daily contact with nature. And I think that comes from radically redesigning how our cities look like. And SUGi is doing just that, which makes it such a pleasure to be here today. So thank you. I'll pass it over to Adrian.
Great. Thanks for that, Nadina. So I've been part of SUGi for about a year and 9 months. So as far as the company has been around, I'm quite new to the whole rewilding process. But I originally started out as a volunteer at one of our plantings in Barking and Dagenham, and now I'm what we call the it's a UK forest lead. And what that means is I'm responsible for all the new plantings that we'll do in the UK. Since we are based in London, the majority of our UK forests are in London. We currently have 31 forests in the city. And my role as a forest maker means I'm responsible for the planning, the designing, and the planting of all of these forests, right? Another aspect of my role is to maintain the forests. We call that forest keeping, okay? And this, once the forests are planted, it takes them about 3 years to become a self-sustaining forest, and that's when it doesn't require any human intervention. So up until that point, I will visit every single forest that we have in London on a regular basis. So that's 31 forests that I visit every 4 to 6 weeks. Um, and I'm the only one who does that. So that really tells you a lot about how much maintenance is required for 31 different sites. Um, I will be responsible for kind of looking at if the forest will require any weeding, on the rare occasion if we need any watering that needs to be done, or sometimes there's damage to the forest. So remedial work will need to be done. And that sometimes means, animals have pulled out saplings or humans have pulled out saplings. So we need to go in and figure out that situation. The main thing that I do with these forests when it comes to maintenance is actually removing trash from them. And that seems to be the main bit of maintenance that's required in a city is, keeping a forest clean from human trash. So another aspect of my role is as a lead for what we call our SUGi walks. Okay, and that's leading groups through 4 of our central London forests, giving them an insight into how SUGi works. It's turned into a great opportunity for like-minded people to meet each other and to network. And it's a 3-hour walking tour that allows individuals to not only learn about SUGi, but to also speak to other people that work in similar fields or have similar interests. Thank you very much. I'll pass it over to you again, Anya.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so lovely to see all those photographs. So we'll get stuck into this conversation. So Nadina, and thank you all for your introductions. Nadina, in your book, Nature of Our Cities, you speak about how the Industrial Revolution changed how we saw nature in our cities. Could you talk a little bit about this transition and what it's actually meant for biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Industrial Revolution, right, for so many things was such a turning point, and I think that's the case for the nature in our cities as well. For centuries, cities, or better put, human settlements and nature were deeply intertwined, right? So the trees provided timber, animals transported the goods, the rivers powered the mills, and then with industrialization, we began to believe that technology and fossil fuels freed us from that reliance, right? Because it was seen as a reliance, and it was a reliance. And nature more and more came to be seen as something, messy and inefficient, and as an obstacle to progress, to tame, and to get away with, essentially. And I think urban planning that we see at that time mirrored a lot of this, right? We see it kind of in straight boulevards and paved streets, in the way that sewers were designed, in the way that rivers were put into canals, very much these controlled facets. And then I do think there was this realization of, okay, if we keep doing this, our cities are going to become very smoggy, stinky, horrible places to be. So you did see, and England was, the big innovator in this space, with parks like with Hyde Park, for example, and the 3 big ones in London. A lot of that landscape architecture design was then brought over to the States and to Canada in many ways. But like, okay, this realization that humans do deeply need nature, but at the time, it was very much for rest and refuge and respite from otherwise very smoggy places to be. And I think what we see now is those same parks, and often they are the same parks that are still being used, instead of just, rest and rejuvenation, it's this whole laundry list of, duties that they now have to fulfill, right? It's places for biodiversity, it's a place for playing, it's a place for leisure, it's a place for running, it's a place for spirituality, it's a place for our climate resilience, for economic, for reducing crime, all of these different facets. So I do think we are starting to see more and more just how reliant on nature we are. And I do believe that, much like the Industrial Revolution, we are, at the turn of yet another turning point, where we're coming to see that, okay, we spent 200 years being deeply disconnected from nature, And we're seeing this, Miles Richardson from the University of Derby showed this in recent research that came out, that there's been a 60% reduction in nature connectedness over the past 220 years. I think we're really starting to see now that nature is not something that is a nice to have, a luxurious, afterthought that we can put in, but nature really, really, really has to be, the heartbeat of our cities. And that is, I think, hopefully a change that we're going to be seeing more and more of. And I do believe we are on the right path, right? An organization like SUGi would not have been able to produce 240 pocket parks in 6 years if they did not have, if they were not riding the wave of that trend. So I do believe the tide is turning, but we, of course, still have a long way to go.
Absolutely. I definitely feel that shift. And I think a lot of people who have joined the chat today are also on that side of change. Kalpana, you talk a lot about our perceived separateness from nature, and it's so hard not to talk about nature in this separatist kind of view. So could you touch a little bit on this idea of separateness and how you think that's contributed to the ecological crisis?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question and deserves a lot of, I think, interweaving of answers. But I think maybe the way I'll approach it today is, something that Nadina, you mentioned when you were doing your introduction was around creating these sort of sticky habits. And that's something that at Play and through Glitch, we've been really kind of focusing on is how do we really move into designing sticky habits in the way that we relate to cities, especially because they have been designed separate from nature, as Nadine just explained. And some of the things that we've been kind of playing around and co-creating with is this idea of, leaning into the sort of rituals that we have currently in our modern society, which is, like scrolling through your phone or scrolling through Instagram, and like how can we actually make that an environment or ecological practice as we're moving across our cities. And I think that's something that we do a lot with Glitch, and I'll make sure to post that within the chat so that people can play around in their own cities and see how that works. But I think one of our main sort of inspirations for creating Glitch was what professor in robotics Peter Kahn termed as generational environmental amnesia, meaning that with every new generation, we have a decreasing understanding of what normal nature is in our cities. And the stat that Nadina, you mentioned, with 60% reduction of our environmental awareness. And I think that really is reflective of the fact that we need to kind of create a new way or a new form of education of how we relate to the nature that is around us. Like, I think, through my work over the last few years, connecting with grassroots communities and also just people who live on my street and speaking to our neighbors, like understanding that, hey, they don't know that we've got a hawthorn tree that is growing across our street. And just we've lost this sort of understanding or sort of environmental literacy of like what just exists around our spaces. And so I think this builds into this idea of how do we find belonging in the spaces that we are. I think right now we're kind of moving through cities and urban environments in complete darkness because we don't really understand the world that is growing around us. And so by being able to build in cultural rituals that are, scaled and enhanced through technology, I think that that's a way to really address the urgency that we're facing, and allow people to kind of create a new set of myths and stories when it comes to belonging in nature. I think there's an overtly kind of romanticization of what nature is through conservation methods. And I think we need to go back to a more localized grassroots level of, how do we actually build connection and relationship to nature? And I think that's something that SUGi does so wonderfully with all of their kind of community planting action days, that you don't need to be a sort of conservation expert or an ecological whiz to just be part of the solutions. And I think that by doing and starting those actions, we start to kind of build those new myths and new stories and understandings of like, what are the species that are around us and that we need in order to actually build resilience for ourselves, for our communities, and for, you know, the generations coming. So I think small acts like that allow us to kind of build that dictionary that we've sort of lost. And hopefully, you know, within that process, really start to redesign and take back the power of like what it means to live in a city. And I think, I don't know, I mean, we always play around with like the definitions of what is urban and what is nature and what is technology. And these lines are so blurry, especially as we're living in a very digital age. And I'll touch more about glitch in the future. I keep leaving little hints here and there, but I think one of the most playful aspects is not finding kind of rigidity in our relationships with nature, because our relationships with nature is so, you know, subjective, and it you know, differentiates between peoples, between communities, between neighborhoods. So I think just finding nuances within those spaces and being able to kind of build in our own ways of coming back by just starting those conversations and starting that approach from a more playful attitude.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Adrian, as a SUGi forest maker, your hands are in the earth every day and you're in our pocket forests every week. So how has this experience informed your view of biodiversity in our cities and our kinship with other species?
Well, I mean, I think that the main thing is it doesn't all come at once. It can come really quickly, but it needs to build. So we always start in the soil. We always think that, you know, well, there's this thought that most of the soil in the city is dead, you know, or dying. So if you're planting into that space, there's not much that is going to be attracted and is going to thrive. So we need to start in a place where you've got that basic foundation, literally the foundation for these interventions for biodiversity to start in. And then it builds from there, and it builds really quickly. You know, it's once you've got that soil sorted out, then you've got the microbiome, organisms growing in there, and then you're attracting bigger organisms, and then that in turn brings in a lot of pollinators and brings in a lot of invertebrates, and that in turn brings in the birds, and that in turn brings in the mammals. So, you know, it's something that really builds very quickly, but you need to start off correctly. You can't just throw a tree in a tree pit and expect that biodiversity in nature is going to just kind of pop up. So that's where I think what we're doing is a really great way of starting out. Like we're kind of taking that, you know, different levels of succession and just bumping it up like to a place where it can really be supercharged, and a place where it can start attracting all the biodiversity that we really want. And by being inside, like I was telling this to people today, I've got like the best job in the world. I sit around in green spaces all day. I look at ladybirds, butterflies, spiders, and I take pictures of them and I upload them up into our files, and I get paid for it. It's just like, you know, it's such a great way to spend your time, but I'm also gaining all of the benefits that we're talking about having green spaces in cities, about, you know, having connection with life. And I don't have any kind of scientific research, or I don't have anything backing that, but I know that my day starts off in a great way, and it you know, it goes in a great way if I'm not behind my computer all day.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely, you know, having green spaces and having life around us is definitely not a good to have. It's definitely a must have.
Absolutely. This year, I don't know about anyone else in London, but I've never seen so many butterflies in the city. So something is happening. And it's interesting what you say is that if you get to know the soil, get to know what it's been missing or what we took from it, restoring that, then everyone comes home and we have a healthier city for everyone. Um, it's all about our interconnections. So, and Nadina, also in your book, there was this really profound moment where you discussed the importance of green space when it came to 9/11 in terms of bringing people together as a place to grieve. Could you touch on the significance of green space in human connection, especially within urban centers, and why wild biodiverse spaces are particularly important in this respect?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't don't realize that there was a lot of kind of community actions that were organized in New York City's parks in the time after 9/11. And I think the mayor at the time, who of course was quickly, he was only mayor for a little bit before being replaced by Mayor Bloomberg, who came into office in January of 2002. So, literally when the smoke was still rising after the 9/11 tragedies. And he worked together with famous actress Bette Midler on something called the New York Restoration Project. Bette Midler had been really inspired by what she'd been seeing in Los Angeles in terms of restoration work, and she wanted to bring that to New York City. And Mayor Bloomberg was really interested mainly because there was a study at the time driven by a couple of research institutions that were using this model called iTree, which was basically a platform, a software suite where you can basically have the input of different tree characteristics, and the output is, what are those trees worth in terms of monetary value for all the different ecosystem services. And what came out of that was this proof that, if you invest a dollar into the New York City urban forest, you would get $5.60 worth of benefits. And of course, Mayor Bloomberg, who came from the world of investment banking, only saw that, had those, what do you like, the money for eyes emoji, like he was like, okay, return on investment, let's go. And so launched, the Million Trees campaign, which I think, we're talking about 15 years ago at this point, 20 years ago. That at the time was revolutionary, right? I think it was the first time that New Yorkers we're starting to understand that there were in fact more trees than skyscrapers in New York, and trees were incredibly important for all of these benefits. But I think 20 years on, what we're understanding now is, much to Adrian's point, to go at tree planting, and the Million Trees campaign, for me, is the perfect example of old-fashioned tree planting, right? Going in just because we have some space here, boom, let's plant a tree, right? Because what people don't like to talk about with the Million Trees campaign is that nobody knows, and I asked while interviewing, one of the founders of that campaign for the book, nobody knows to this day, nobody can tell me how many of those million trees are still alive today. And I think we know the answer to that, because many of them, were tiny little, saplings that were treated, and there was no aftercare. And mind you, I kind of talk about it like they're planted like orphans, right? They have no community around them, no good foundation, all these points that Adrian was talking about, right? So I think we're really starting to understand, the future, I think, of urban greening really lies in biodiversity, and biodiversity does not come in single planted trees, those, and depending on the species that you're planting, those become biodiversity deserts in many ways. So all of that to say, I think 9/11, provided this base for this whole new look at urban trees and at urban parks. There was a whole rise of investment during that time that, was repeated in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy came along and proved again why urban green infrastructure is so important, this time for flood risk. And I think now we're starting to understand just how important biodiversity is. And I think that biodiversity question, and we're seeing this kind of in the broader climate talks, right? Less and less talk about carbon emissions and more talk about ecosystem restoration and biodiversity. And I'm loving to see that transition more and more also play out in our urban spaces.
Absolutely. And we'll get into the kind of digital ecology and all the work that you've been researching, and also the Miyawaki method and how successful it is in urban forests. But Kalpana, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but a lot of your work is about togetherness in nature, so bringing people together. Can you touch a little bit on the role of nature in human ritual, and giving people a sense of belonging, especially for urban dwellers, and maybe from like parts of your own work in how you do this and what you've learned about this connection.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, I sort of touched on it a little bit earlier, but I guess kind of to go a little bit deeper into the example with Glitch. So we'll share it in the chat hopefully, but essentially the kind of mechanism in which we designed the platform to kind of be able to implement these sort of sticky habits among citizens was to build a sort of character. And that character is this chat bug instead of a bot. So it was a play on words there. But that character is called Glitch. And it was really inspired from Legacy Russell's work called Glitch Cyberfeminism, which looks at the way that we can sort of hack our technologies or create kind of fractures in the way that we consume or interact with technology in order to create a softer relationship with the devices that we use or whatever kind of technological interfaces we have. And I bring up technology because I think in this day and age, it is such a deep part of the way that we make rituals, especially in urban spaces. And more people, at the moment have access to a phone than, a local green space or a local park. So I think we have to take these solutions hand in hand. And something that we sort of started including in the design process was looking at technology not as this sort of separate world in which we kind of coexist with, but more of an entanglement that is connected to nature. And in that way, start to build a ritual that is connected to urban growing and urban planting that is facilitated through, a digital connection like a chat bug. And I feel like when it comes to building rituals, as I mentioned, it's so contextual, it's so subjective to the person. But I think in cities, we've got such an incredible space of opportunity and possibility because cities hold an incredible array of culture. And I think culture, not just ties us to the social dynamics between people and individuals, but also to land. And it's always connected to land. And, one of my favorite examples of this is like UK, festivals. And in London, they're usually, hosted in, the biggest parks across London, whether it's Hyde Park or Victoria Park. And I think that's a really wonderful way to start kind of looking at the way that, modern culture can connect to the past and the future, and start kind of wiring our brains, not just to kind of consume culture as entertainment, but really as a way to weave ourselves back into our natural spaces and our natural world. So whether we do that through the devices and the apps and platforms that we use, but also, the day-to-day activities that we sign up to, whether, it's festivals or, swimming at your local Lido, anything that you can do outdoors in spaces, I think ties into that. But similarly, kind of trying to rewire our brains from seeing nature as this sort of external thing and objectifying it as something out there, and really starting to connect with it as a subjective internal experience where you can see yourself interweaved back into your environment. And I think when we switch from that, just from a passerby or citizen that is just kind of going through their 9 to 5 every day and then going into their local shops, and for me, I think third spaces really do this so well. And I think that's where pocket parks and even just like a bench that is near a park or a tree can start creating these sort of pockets of spaces where people can form different ways that work for them, in their day-to-days to find belonging and ritual and connection. But yeah, I think for us nowadays, one of the things that we really try to do is make sure that people find their own kind of frameworks in building those connections. And we're just facilitating the process through the ways that we are building those technological tools for them and with them.
Absolutely. Love that. And I think this really plays into my next question for Adrian, that's focused on the Miyawaki method. And maybe, Adrian, what you've noticed about, the process of the Miyawaki method is all about engaging people and getting people's hands in the earth and getting involved and realizing that you have a stake in your environment. You can be part of something. So maybe what's something you've noticed about how people shift their mindset or orient themselves in the world or find a new belonging through joining these planting sessions?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing is there's joy, there's connection to the soil. Like as soon as they start planting, I think I was reading something about what is it called? Mycobacterium vaccae, which is a kind of a bacteria that's in the soil. Once it gets into your hands, underneath your nails, it gets well, yeah, it gets into your system and it starts allowing you to release serotonin. And that gives you that feeling of joy, of kind of belonging. So where possible, we tell people don't wear gloves, get your hands into the soil, get involved in it and really enjoy it. And you can see how quickly that kind of translates and how the adults that are involved become a lot more relaxed and a lot less reserved, and the children just love getting and digging into the soil. Um, they're always people are always really surprised of how quickly we can plant a forest. So we can do something like 3,000 trees in about 3 or 4 hours. It's just incredible how the methodology is designed so that these kind of things can go really quickly. Um, Part of the other things is so some of the things that I really noticed with planting with adults is the density of the planting. They find that planting 3.3.5 trees per square meter a really odd concept. That's because, in when it comes to a certain aesthetic that you have for a garden or especially a urban green space, when you're putting that much planting into a small space like that, it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't look like it's it's going to work, that they're going to smother each other. And part of the success of what we have is that closeness, that connection, so that the roots of the plants can really connect with each other very quickly. Um, I mean, some of the other things that I really love seeing is how the children really have this huge switch of uncertainty. And this usually comes around with schools that are in areas that have less tree equity, where they rarely have a garden, that they rarely have a good green space within walking distance of them, that they don't really understand what they're supposed to be doing, and what they'll find in the soil. But once they start digging around and they see the first worm, they're like, "Oh, it's a worm! It's so incredible!" Um, and I mean, their understanding of how to plant as well just really changes because they don't have that connection with nature. We did a planting in Ireland in February, and we had a group of 7 and 8-year-olds. And some of the plants that we're doing are bare root, so they don't have any soil on them. So it's kind of difficult for the children to understand which way is up and which way is down. So a lot of them were asking, do I plant it this way? And they were pointing with the roots facing up. Um, so you can kind of see in these spaces or in these places that the connection has never been there. Uh, and to see them have that connection, uh, and the joy and the understanding that they get from it is great. you'll get these children who, in schools especially, who have never planted a tree before. And we plant a tree with them, and then we come back when I'm doing my visits. And they'll want to know, how is my tree doing? And they'll want to go out and look for their specific tree. I planted this one, I planted this one. But over time, that starts changing, and they start going from, oh, how is my tree doing, to how is our forest doing? You know, and there is this great example of how that connection with the single tree starts becoming a community thing, or a community endeavor. Like they start looking at it as a big group of things, as opposed to that individual one thing that they did.
Absolutely. That shift from individualistic thinking to collectivism, which is so important for the environment. Love that. Nadina, in your book, you also, this is carries on from what we were talking about there. So you discuss this concept called plant blindness. Could you discuss a little bit about what this means and the impact of it on, not only on a ecological level, but also on a social level too, and the various technological initiatives that are being developed to combat it?
Yeah, I think plant blindness is something that I think recently got kind of a lot of media headlines. Same with insect blindness. Same with blush blindness, which is apparently also a thing on TikTok. People not knowing how much blush they wear, all these kind of different blindness. But plant blindness is basically our tendency to overlook the plants around us, just to simply not see them, to literally be blind to them. And if we do see them, to kind of see them as this kind of swath of green. And, you know, there's this reality. I can't cite the source off the top of my head, but this study that was done that showed that, you know, children can identify, you know, hundreds of different, you know, brand names and logos, but, you know, they can't even identify a dozen or 10 native, you know, plant and tree species. And this is something that I'm sure both Kalpana and Adrian have seen, you know, in their work in day to day. I mean, Adrian was just talking about this, right? So, and then, you know, I talk in the book and we're like, okay, well, so what? Like, why do we care that kids can't identify 10 different local tree species? Like, why should we even care about that? And I think it really comes down to the idea that Attenborough always said this, but like you cannot care about what you do not know, and you know, you cannot love what you do not care about. Obviously, he said it way better than me, but along those lines of like you need to really be able to relate to something, to understand something, to be able to name it in order to even start caring about it. So I think that's where nature connection starts. I think that's where connection to place, belonging to place, connection to place starts, is understanding what grows around you, what lives around you. This idea that, you know, cities are not just for Homo sapiens, that in fact we share these spaces with so many different other non-human species, and understanding what those are is really at the core of being able to take better care of those species, and you know, and in turn have those, you know, those species and those spaces take better care of us. To my earlier point, I think we're starting to understand just more and more that if nature is not, you know, at the very heart of urban life, we will suffer, right? Nature, this is not about saving nature. This is about saving human beings. And if we do not invite nature back into our lives, human beings will suffer, right? And we'll see this through flooding, we'll see this through heat, we'll see this through mental health, through a kind of a sense of hopelessness and lack of purpose that I think especially a lot of younger generations are facing right now. So, and all of that, you know, weirdly enough, starts with understanding what plant is that, what tree is that, what bug is that. And that's why I really love the Citizen Science Campaign City Nature Challenge, which runs, it's been going on for 10 years now. I got the opportunity to organize one for myself in Curaçao, which is a small Dutch island in the Caribbean, which had never done a full-scale biodiversity survey before. And the City Nature Challenge was started by two women, one at the California Academy of Sciences, the other one at the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum. And they basically wanted to engage the public in the work that they were doing. So they did that by inviting the community to use iNaturalist, which is one of the most famous flora and fauna ID apps that we have out there. based off of AI, of course, which makes it all possible, not just for the identification, but also what do we do with all of that data? And they invited the public to go out and do a 4-day BioBlitz, which is essentially, BioBlitz is just a term where you essentially ask, could be scientists, but in this case, just regular folks to go out and do a biodiversity survey of an area. Each SUGi pocket forest could have its own little BioBlitz where you start to identify what's there. And you use the app iNaturalist to do that. And the incredible thing is, so this has been going on 10 years now. Nearly 1,000 cities have participated over this 4-day period, typically always at the end of April. Last year, they got something like just over 3 million observations worldwide. They had over 100,000 people participating. And what I love so much about this is, we don't have anything, again, going back to Miles Richardson's research, we have currently nothing in our calendars that are perhaps maybe summer solstice comes close, but we have nothing in kind of our Western calendars that celebrate nature. And this is something that puts nature in your calendar, a celebration of nature, a 4-day celebration of nature, where you're not only understanding, what lives and grows around you and creating this open source biodiversity database, which is all very helpful, but you're providing people with an opportunity to engage with nature, which is something they normally would not do. And I was so fascinated and enamored by the City Nature Challenge that before I ever organized my own, I actually traveled to La Paz in Bolivia, which is kind of the epicenter of City Nature Challenge success. That city has won the City Nature Challenge for the past 4 years in a row, meaning that they got the most people involved, the most species, most observations made, and the most species logged. And that they've been doing that for the past 4 years. And the secret ingredient, which I was so curious about, why is La Paz, yes, a very biodiversity, but otherwise, relatively unknown. Why are they so successful in this? And their key to success is that they have gotten nearly every single high school and university involved in this. And now they're expanding it to also include lower education as well, or younger grades, which means that it's not, it's baked into the curriculum. Like I was there producing a documentary for National Geographic about this. And I interviewed a high school teacher, high school biology teacher that participates every year. And she said she would not let her students back into the classroom until they identified at least 200 species. And to Kalpana's point that she said earlier, more people have access to a smartphone than they do a green space. Including all of these high school students, including all of these Bolivian high school students, right? They all, as of like age 11, and like we can get into another conversation about whether or not we think that's a good idea, but at least these high school students, have access to a smartphone, are able to do this, right? And why not meet them where they are and help them understand, their direct surroundings? And it's led, I'll just end with this. It's led to some incredible stories from all over the world, like high school students that found this endangered salamander that had not been seen in over 50 years. She contributed to a scientific publication about it when she was a high school student, and she's now in a degree for zoology to understand, it really kind of led her on this career path. There's so many stories of high schoolers rediscovering species that had not been seen. In La Paz, they had that with a blueberry bush and with a snake species, both of them rediscovered by high school students. Of course, the high school student didn't know what it was when they took the photo, but then later, thanks to iNaturalist, was like, okay, in fact, this has never been logged, show the experts, and indeed it hadn't been logged. And so there's so many stories of participating in something as simple as a little BioBlitz in your local park, or because your school made you, because it's part of the curriculum, and it completely, revolutionizing, the path that you were on to one that was much more, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to make a career out of ecology, but I think it does, radically change and at least combat plant blindness at the very least.
Absolutely. And that has generational impacts too. So incredible work to undo everything we've done. Kalpana, you also work with a lot of nature deprived communities. What's something you've learned? Why is this work important for you? And like, what's something you've learned about this? And maybe talk a little bit about your work in Right to Grow.
Thanks. I was actually thinking and being reminded of a quote by Saidiya Hartman, who was also a thinker and a dreamer in political activism, and she often said that one of our greatest challenges is one of the greatest acts of oppression is policing our imagination. And I think it really relates to plant blindness. I think it's really hard for us to actually, like, as peoples and as a community living in cities, and obviously then there's like systemic institutional challenges in who gets to build and dream and create new worlds. But if we don't understand what plants grow around us or what nature is around us, it's really hard for us to dream of something else or dream and see another future coming into being. And I think, there's a really deep part of social justice that really needs to come with the green spaces that are built across cities. And I feel like London is really paving the way in bringing that people power and that grassroots power into co-designing cities through various organizations. There's really incredible groups like Cocoa Collective, Phytology, Garden of Earthly Delights around London, and so many more. But I think similarly to democratizing our access to nature, I feel like we have to democratize our tech and who gets to have access to these design tools, especially because the way that, the technology that's been sort of given to us is just designed for commerce and for business rather than really future building and future resilience for communities and for cities. And so something that we've been doing with Glitch is really taking that co-design element of asking sort of through like a citizen survey format, asking people what kind of green spaces do you want to see this? And we're working with directly with councils and governments to apply that data into action within those communities. And so the Right to Grow has been a really sort of influential part and sort of, yeah, co-designer within the way that we're like applying the citizen approach. And so I mentioned earlier that the Right to Grow is basically a petition towards different councils and governments to get access to maps for where citizens can actually grow in public spaces. And I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but in the UK, as for example, if we use the land that was available in cities to grow and for community growing projects, we could grow 40% of our fruit and vegetables. And that could be with, pocket food forests included. And there's just so much land that is available but isn't being used appropriately or in the right spaces to benefit community and people. And, we are taking that kind of like two-prong approach of working, top level with governments and councils, but also just working with communities to just do the work on the ground. We're very much in a very kind of guerrilla garden styled way of not waiting for permission in order to, create those futures that we need right now. It's not that we need them like 10 years in the future. And I think, Adrian, that picture that you shared earlier of, the heat level effects across London in a really, through a heat wave or in a really hot summer, and we're just going to keep getting hotter. And it's not to like bring more doom and gloom into the space, but actually to face the reality of the challenges that we're facing and understanding that our governments, our councils are not working quick enough, but people can actually meet those solutions, and technology can actually help facilitate to scale that out in ways that are actually democratic across our communities. So I think part of our methodology is really working towards democratizing access to those tools and to that knowledge. And yeah, the Right to Grow has been a really beautiful framework for us to work across cities and across different countries. So we'll definitely like leave those links available so that people can join because it's growing across cities. But if you're in London, we'd definitely love to see you there.
Absolutely. I'm all there for that because I'm on a very long waiting list for an allotment. So I'll be writing to you. Adrian, I know SUGi does so much work for green equity, and I know a lot of the work that we do is in nature deprived areas. But also, I also want you to touch on the great study that we're doing with Oxford University, because there's growing evidence that focuses on the fact that biodiversity is not just an ecological concern, it's intrinsically connected to our health and our mental health and our joy and our sense of belonging. So And it's a difficult thing to quantify sometimes. So, Adrian, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I kind of mentioned it earlier, is how I feel from being inside of our forests, being in contact with nature. What we're trying to do with the University of Oxford is to, have the backing, the scientific backing to prove that. So we're working with the Oxford University Long-Term Ecology Lab. And we started that today. I was there from 9 o'clock this morning till just before coming online, where we are measuring the VOC, so the volatile organic compounds that are emitted from trees and from plants, and how that can have a beneficial effect on the physiological and the psychological aspects of humans, health of humans, that kind of thing. So by sitting in that space and by breathing in the VOCs, your physiology benefits from it and your mood changes. You get this feeling of calmness, less anxiety, more focus. The Serenity Forest is great because it's right across the street from the Royal Brompton Hospital, and and it's got all of these tiered stairs that lead up to the forest at a higher level. But what that creates is this great circle for people to sit down and to have a meal, to have a break, to kind of reflect. And this is what we're trying to show, that with this study, is that these urban spaces can do the same thing as going to New Forest, to traveling halfway around the world to get immersed into really large green spaces. So yeah.
There's one question that came up that was curious about our perspectives about the access and equity to nature spaces that aren't our equal and marginalized communities, and this kind of question. I think it's one that I get a lot, and I'm curious if Adrian Kalpana get that too. And my answer to that question is schools. Like schoolyards are if we talk about urban acupuncture and those pressure points, schoolyards are some of the most effective leverage points. The majority of kids that live in cities are going to school. Schools are everywhere. Every child is going to school, from age 4 in the Netherlands to 18, 16. They are one of they're spending the majority of their time Monday to Friday at these places. And we can get into all of the direct benefits that those, kids and students can have by having nature so close to them and having that be, this daily source of contact. And then we can get into all these, generational shifts and what that means for, dropout rates, bullying, crime, there's just greening schoolyards. And I'm really curious also, Adrian, to hear your perspective on this. And Elise, I see you're back on with us as well. Because SUGi, a lot of the 240 pocket books that you guys have done have been on schoolyards and with schools. So I'm curious, what are some of the changes that you guys have seen with students? Because Adrian, in my books, you deserve a gold medal for dealing with teenagers, because that is the scariest demographic I've ever had to work with. And I know when you said they were not looking forward to the planning day, but then the other day I got this picture with them, I've been there, and it is absolutely incredible to see the difference that you can make in kids' lives. So I'm curious about kind of SUGi's perspectives about intervening at schoolyards particularly.
Yeah. That school that I showed was pretty scary at first. They come from an area of London where it's really very low tree cover. There's not a lot of wealth around there too. and all of these children have been expelled from other schools, so they have to go to this school in order to get their final grade to get a diploma from secondary school. And when they came out, like they wanted the biggest spade I could give them. They're like, I want a big spade. They didn't want the little trowels that I had for them. They're like, I want a big spade. No, this isn't big enough. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna get killed here. But to see them like really get involved, and then there was that kind of like, oh, how many trees have you planted? How many trees? I've planted 20. I've done this. It's just that big change that happens once they start getting involved in it is huge. And I agree. It's getting children from really early on to understand the value of having green spaces of plants of connection with nature is the way forward. And I think, when we've planted these forests, what we've created was a space for a lot of these schools to do this thing called forest school in the UK. It's a primary school curriculum where they get a forest school teacher to come out and teach children about things like, can you name this tree by looking at its leaves? And, let's look at some butterflies, let's look at some caterpillars and that kind of thing. So what we're doing is we're effectively building a forest for them so that they can actually do those kind of bits of education. So I think, we're definitely trying to engage them. It's a little bit challenging because we don't have the resources to continually engage them on, let's say, a weekly basis or even a monthly basis. So we kind of have to hand it over to the schools to be able to actually take it further. And a lot of them will start developing an eco club once we've got, a forest for them, so that they are coming out to do maintenance and to water the forests. And then they're also doing trash collecting and all that kind of stuff. So it's getting them out of the classroom, which they all love. Who doesn't want to go out and run around in a forest as opposed to sitting and looking at their books? So yeah, that kind of connection is fantastic. And what we're hoping is that they're bringing that back to their communities at home, and having that person on the inside in those communities is the best way to gain access to everybody else, because it's not an outsider that's coming in and telling them, oh yeah, we need these trees, we need these connections. It's somebody from within the community that they trust, that is building with those things, with those bits of education that we're kind of bringing to the work to the schools.
Well, I think we should wrap things up because we've gone over, but thank you everyone for joining us. There was so much stuff that we didn't even get through, but thank you so much for joining us, and to the lovely speakers for being here with us. Please join them on their social media. You can put it in the chats if you want, and for news of our events and various things that are happening from our side, just sign on to the newsletter. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you, Anya, for doing such a great job hosting. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great to speak to everybody.